Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the next TrueDem webinar. It's a monthly occasion. We meet every month to discuss various aspects and new emerging topics in the field of trust research. And today we are particularly delighted to have with us Melinda Pozzi, who is a postdoctoral researcher in the Department of Logic and Philosophy of Science at the University of California, Irvine. Her academic background spans philosophy, language sciences, information and communication sciences, and cognitive science. Her research examines the interplay between commitment and trust in communication, employing interdisciplinary approaches such as experimental psychology, pragmatics, agent-based modeling, and philosophical theory. She earned her PhD in cognitive science from the University of Neuchâtel in Switzerland, where she investigated the cognitive mechanisms that help individuals maintain epistemic vigilance while assessing communicated information. Her current work explores how effectively these mechanisms counter misinformation on a collective scale through modeling and simulations. And the topic of her presentation today is speaker trustworthiness. Shall confidence match the evidence? Melinda, please, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much for inviting me to give a talk for this webinar. I'm very happy to present this paper in the context of political trust and trustworthiness. My paper is not specifically about political trust, but about speaker trustworthiness in general. But I will draw some implications for trust towards politicians as well. So in this paper, I present one of my PhD studies that I have conducted at the University of Neuchâtel in Switzerland with my PhD supervisor, Professor Diana Mazzarella. So let's start with an example that we might have experienced during COVID time. So imagine that you're planning to have a dinner with your friend Brian, but you are a bit hesitant because you have to take a flight the week after to give a conference. And so you don't want to take any risk of getting COVID before the flight. And Brian, willing to reassure you, says, I'm sure that I don't have COVID. So you meet Brian for dinner before your flight. And then it turns out that Brian was in fact affected by the virus. So how would you judge Brian's trustworthiness, given that Brian was confident but wrong? But now let's say that Brian, willing to prove his honesty, shows you the result of the PCR test that he did the day before his claim, and this was negative. So how would you evaluate his trustworthiness now that you know that Brian was justified to be confident even if he was wrong? And now let's imagine another scenario. Again, Brian says that he's sure he doesn't have COVID. So you meet Brian for a dinner before your flight. But this time, it turns out that Brian was indeed not affected by the virus. So how would you judge Brian's trustworthiness, given that he was confident and accurate? But now, let's say that you want to check whether Brian had good reason to be confident about the fact that he didn't have COVID. And you ask Brian if he did a test, and he replies that he didn't do any test to check if he had COVID. So how would you judge Brian's trustworthiness, given that he was confident, accurate, but not really justified in being confident? So maybe he had weak evidence because he didn't have any symptoms, but he didn't have strong evidence enough to be confident about the fact that he didn't have COVID. So he was, in a sense, accurate by chance. So there are three variables here that are important for this presentation. First, there is the variable of confidence. So in both scenarios, Brian is confident about the fact that he doesn't have COVID. Then we have the variable of accuracy. So in the first scenario, Brian is inaccurate because he has, in fact, the virus. And in the second scenario, Brian is accurate because he's indeed not affected by the virus. And finally, we have the variable of evidence. So in the first scenario, Brian has strong evidence to be confident because he has a PCR test that was negative. And in the second scenario, Brian had only weak evidence or no evidence, but we can say he had no symptoms, so he had weak evidence, but he didn't have strong evidence because he didn't do any tests to check whether he had COVID. So we'll see in this presentation that these three variables are really important cues of trustworthiness, because as we know, communication is risky. So there is always the risk of intentional or accidental misinformation. And evolutionary psychologists, Dan Sperber and colleagues, have suggested that in face of this risk, humans have evolved some mechanism of epistemic vigilance that enable them to select reliable sources of information. So how does it work? What are the cues that people use to calibrate their trust? So there are many studies that have looked at different cues of trustworthiness. For example, there are studies that have shown that people are more likely to believe someone who is an expert in the specific domain. So expertise is a cue of epistemic trustworthiness. People are also more likely to believe a speaker who has access to information. They are more likely to believe someone who was accurate in the past. They are also more likely to believe someone who is presented as benevolent. Emotions can also affect trust. So people are more likely to believe someone who seems happy compared to someone who seems angry. And people are also more likely to believe someone who is from the same group. So these are different cues of epistemic trustworthiness, and they affect trust. So people are more likely to trust someone who has these cues, for example, who is expert, who has access to information, and so on. And in this presentation, I will focus on these three following cues of epistemic trustworthiness: the expression of confidence, accuracy, and evidence. And these three cues are related to what we call speakers' epistemic commitment. So when people communicate, they are expected to say the truth. So they have a commitment towards the truth of the information that they share. And in this sense, expressing confidence is a way of taking a commitment. And the more confidence we express, the more committed we are towards the information that we share. And the philosopher Catherine Hawley, she defined trustworthiness in relation to commitment. And according to her, being trustworthy requires two things. So the first requirement is that we should fulfill the commitments that we already acquired. So in this context, this would mean that when we express confidence, we should say something true. And the second requirement is that we should take commitments that we are competent to fulfill. So if we express something with confidence, we should have evidence for this information. So here, I wanted to give a real example that happened again during COVID, and that might be more relevant to the context of political trust. So it was the case where the World Health Organization claimed that COVID-19 is not airborne. And so they wrote not in capital letters as to remove any doubt about that. So they expressed confidence about this information. And in the experimental literature, researchers have shown that information from confident, and therefore committed, speakers is more believed and memorized. So again, this literature was not about political trust specifically, but we can also think how this could generalize to the context of political trust. But researchers have also shown that overconfident speakers are typically deemed less trustworthy. So here, the World Health Organization expressed a very high confidence for something that turned out to be wrong in the end. So COVID-19 is also airborne, so can spread through the air. And here, so we could wonder whether the reputation of the World Health Organization could have a cost for being overconfident, especially because in the case of political trust, usually very important decisions and health measures, for example, are taken based on the information that is shared. So now I just wanted to present a study that had been conducted also by researchers in Switzerland. The study that showed that overconfident speakers are usually deemed less trustworthy. So this experiment was done with students, and I realized later when I was reading the paper that I was one of these participants at that time. And so the participants had to imagine that they wanted to reach the Swiss manager for international coordination. And they asked these two virtual colleagues if they know who is this person and where they can find him. So in this experiment, it was a little video. So you had also the intonation and the facial expressions. But here I will only share the text that the colleagues said. So one colleague says, "Hi, international coordination, I know him. It's Mr. Declou in building L for Lausanne. You can believe me, I'm sure it's him." And the other colleague says, "Hi, I don't know, but I think that for the international coordination, it's Mr. Grandjean in building B for Bern, but I'm really not sure." So here you see that the two colleagues say something different, but one is confident and the other one is not confident about that. And then participants were asked, "Who do you believe?" And in this case, they were more likely to believe the confident speaker because they had only access to the expression of confidence. But then participants were told that both colleagues were wrong. So the Swiss manager was another person in another building. And participants were asked a punishment question. So they had to decide who they wanted to punish between these two colleagues. So this was the following punishment questions. A few days later, your boss asks you to find somebody to put the 2,000 invitations for the collaborators' dinner in their envelope and to stamp them during lunch break. You are the team leader of the two colleagues seen during the coffee break. Whom do you give the task to? So it's a kind of punishment question. They have to decide to whom they want to give this task. And in this case, participants were more likely to punish the overconfident speaker. So we can see now that the overconfident speaker had a direct cost. And then participants were also asked a trust question. They were asked, since you are new in town, you are looking for a good kindergarten for your kids, whom do you ask advice from? And in this case, they were more likely to select the colleague who was not confident. So again, we see that now there was a kind of reputational cost for the overconfident speaker, because later participants preferred to trust the person who was not confident. So the one who was not overconfident. So the overconfident speaker is less likely to be believed in the future. So this was an experiment that showed that overconfident speakers are deemed less trustworthy. But there is also an experiment by Tenney and colleagues who show that this is not the case when the speaker is justified by evidence. And if we go back to the example of the World Health Organization, so they expressed confidence about the fact that COVID-19 was not a warrant, but they based this also on the evidence that they had at that time based on scientific data, especially the previous scientific research that usually respiratory viruses generally spread through droplets. So they fall directly quite quickly on the ground and they don't spread that much through the air. So they base this claim on this evidence. Then, of course, we can always debate what is strong and good evidence, but at that time, they said it was the evidence they had. So this is the first scenario that we had with Brian. So when Brian is confident, he's inaccurate because he has COVID, but he has evidence with the PCR test. But we were also interested in the second scenario, the one in which Brian is confident, accurate, but not enough justified. So this is the case where we call the speaker the lucky speaker, because he is accurate by chance. So we wanted to test these two scenarios in this study. So in the first experiment, we tested the first hypothesis that was already supported by Kenny and colleagues. So we wanted to replicate this hypothesis that overconfidence does not backfire when a confident but inaccurate claim is justified by strong evidence. And in the second experiment, we wanted to test this new hypothesis that confidence can backfire when a confident and accurate claim is not justified by enough evidence. So we adapted the experiment by Tini and colleagues. So it was again done online, and participants had to imagine that they were a judge in court, and they had to evaluate a car accident case. And they had to base their evaluation on two witness depositions. So here you see the two witnesses, and you can see that they disagree on which car is at fault. So one witness says that it's the red car's fault. The other one says that it's the gray car's fault. They are both sure about that. But there was another piece of information that we manipulated, and it was the identification of the passenger. So one witness identified the passenger with high confidence, and the other one identified the same passenger, but he's not sure about that. And we asked participants to rate the credibility of each witness and to make a choice between the two depositions. And the prediction was that the confident witness will be judged more trustworthy. So it will be rated as more credible and will be more likely to be believed than the unconfident witness. So this is the time where they have only access to the expression of confidence. But then at time 2, we give participants information about the accuracy. So we tell them that both witnesses were wrong. They identified the wrong passenger. And again, we ask them to rate the credibility of each witness, and we ask them to make a choice between the two depositions. So in the real experiment, the deposition was longer with other details, so they could still evaluate the rest of the deposition. But here I just present the two most important information. And here the prediction was that the confident witness will lose his trustworthiness to the benefit of the unconfident witness. And at time 3, we give participants information about the strength of evidence. So we told them that the passenger had an identical twin who was also friends with the driver. So from this information, they could infer that the two witnesses had strong evidence to identify the passenger because he had an identical twin. And here the prediction was that the confident witness trustworthiness will be restored because it was, in a sense, justified to be confident. So we asked participants to rate the credibility and to make a choice at three different times, so that we could see how the results change according to the three variables. And here are the results. So on the left, you see the credibility rating. And on the right, you see the binary choice between the two depositions. And so if we look at time 1, when they have only access to the expression of confidence, the participants rated the confident witness as more credible than the unconfident witness on the left. And on the right, we see that they were more likely to select the deposition of the confident witness. But at time 2, when they learned that both witnesses were wrong, we see on the left this credibility drop for the overconfident speaker. And on the right, we see that now they are more likely to select the deposition of the unconfident witness. And finally, at time 3, when they learned that both witnesses had strong evidence, the identical twin, so we see that now on the left, the credibility rating of the confident speaker is restored. Not completely, because it's a bit lower compared to time 1. But now they rated the confident witness as credible as the unconfident witness. And on the right, we see that now they are again more likely to select the deposition of the confident witness. So with these results, we could replicate Tenney and colleagues' findings, and we could support the hypothesis that overconfidence does not backfire when a confident but inaccurate claim is justified by strong evidence. So now I will present experiment 2. So for time 1, it was exactly the same as time 1 for experiment 1. So again, we have these 2 witnesses who disagree on which car is at fault. They identify the same passenger, but one is confident and the other one is not confident. And again, we asked participants to rate the credibility of each witness and to make a choice between the 2 depositions. And the prediction was the same. So at time 1, the confident witness will be judged more trustworthy. So it will be more, it will be rated as more credible and will be more likely to be believed than the unconfident witness. But now at time 2, when we give information about accuracy, this time we told participants that both witnesses were accurate. So they identified the right passenger. And again, we asked them to rate the credibility of each witness, and we asked them to make a choice between the 2 depositions. And so here the prediction was that the confident witness will keep his trustworthiness, or maybe even increase, but at least keep his trustworthiness. And finally, at time 3, we gave participants information about the strength of evidence, and this time they had only weak evidence. So we told participants that according to the camera, the passenger had his back turned the whole time and his face was not visible. So from this information, they could infer that witnesses had only weak evidence for the identification of the passenger. And here, the prediction was that the confident witness will suffer a reputational loss because he had only weak evidence. So here are the results. Again, on the left, we have the credibility rating. On the right, we have the binary choice between the 2 depositions. For time 1, when they have only information about confidence, we see that we have the same results as for experiment 1 at time 1. So on the left, we see that they rated the confident witness as more credible than the unconfident witness. And on the right, we see that they were more likely to select the deposition of the confident witness. At time 2, we see that it's even more the case when they learned that both witnesses were accurate. So the credibility of the confident witness even increased. And they were even more likely to select his deposition. But at time 3, when we give information about the strength of evidence, and they learned that they had only weak evidence, we see again on the left a credibility drop for the confident witness. And on the right, we see now that they were as likely to select the deposition of the confident and unconfident witness. So with these 2 experiments, we could support the 2 hypotheses. So with the first experiment, we supported the first hypothesis that overconfidence does not backfire when a confident but inaccurate claim is justified by strong evidence. And with the second experiment, we could support the second hypothesis that confidence can backfire if a confident and accurate claim is not justified by enough evidence. So the take-home message from this particular study is that reputation in communication depends on how well the informer's confidence is calibrated to their evidence. And so trustworthy speakers are those who calibrate their expressed confidence to evidence. And now we can discuss the possible implications for political trust and trustworthiness. So this study is relevant to any scholars interested in understanding how speakers achieve the goals through communication while managing their credibility and reputation. And this also includes scholars of political discourse and its potential impact on the audience trust. And as we know, like politicians need also to appear confident and cannot permanently edge their claims, or they would lose their credibility. But given the stakes involved and the higher expectations for their commitment, politicians have to find some strategy to appear competent while keeping their reputation. Because when we look at the experiment that I've just presented, the stakes and consequences for the participants were not very high, but in the context of political trust, of course, the consequences for the audience and the speaker are higher. So it's really important also to look at that in future studies. So there is a study that shows that politicians tend to use a specific prosody that makes them sound charismatic and confident. And Tenney and colleagues in another study, they suggest that expressing confidence with prosody is a way of conveying confidence while being less committed, because it's easier to deny having been confident when you use prosody for expressing confidence compared to the use of verbal expression of certainty, such as "I'm sure that." So this was proposed as a strategy for politicians to appear confident and managing their reputation. There is also another study that shows that politicians usually express confidence when they are interviewed, but they lower their commitment when they are challenged. So for example, they use models such as "it might be the case." So they use models to lower the commitment by expressing some uncertainty. And one point that I also wanted to mention is that in the study that I presented today, the two witnesses had direct perceptual evidence. So this is a very strong type of evidence. But politicians usually base their claims on second-hand evidence, for example, on scientific data, on surveys, on reports. And so to manage their reputation, politicians should also specify their sources, especially when they did not acquire the information by themselves, because specifying their source is another way for politicians to modulate their commitment. For example, if they claim to have first-hand evidence, this is more committal than claims to second-hand evidence. And usually when speakers do not specify their sources, addressees tend to assume that the claim is based on first-hand evidence. And so we have another study with my PhD supervisors, which we're still under review, where we found that if speakers pretend to have direct evidence while they have only second-hand evidence, this could be costly. So we might wonder also in the case of expressing confidence without mentioning that the information is based on second-hand evidence, maybe that could be detrimental to their reputation. And finally, I also wanted to acknowledge the fact that some politicians are still believed and supported by their followers, even after being wrong or not justified. For example, there is also a bias, so people are more likely to believe people who have similar beliefs as them. So for example, they're more likely to follow a particular politicians even if this politician is said to be something wrong, maybe they are less likely to believe those who affirm that he shared some wrong information. Also, maybe they're more likely to punish a politician who doesn't share the same beliefs. Again, we can also debate about which kind of evidence we consider as strong or not. So even if the politician could seem justified by evidence, maybe this is not enough for the people who do not support this politician. So these are really future questions that should be investigated in future research. But I just wanted to end with this sentence that can summarize this research. So expressing confidence only when one is justified is a better sign of epistemic responsibility than sharing true information which may be accidentally transmitted by people not deeply concerned about truth. Thank you for your attention. I just also wanted to mention that the picture that I'm sharing here is a picture that was made by my previous supervisor. So it was for a project called My Work Picture by AI. And for this picture, she used the abstract of this paper. So I found it nice to show you how AI represents this work. So thank you again for your attention. And I also shared the references at the end so that you can check in the recorded video later. So thank you again for your attention.
Thank you so much, Melinda, for your very interesting presentation. The floor is now open for discussion. If you have any questions, technical questions, other questions, or just comments, remarks that you would like to share, please feel free to post those messages in chat. Or if you feel like speaking, please raise your hand and speak up. We look forward to your questions and comments. And while everybody is thinking, let me please start with a couple of questions that I noted. First of all, one small technical question. I believe in your sample there was 108 respondents, right? And 78 of them were females. So the male respondents were a little bit less. And here is the question. Did you notice any gender-related differences in how males and females maybe evaluated these experiments, the different pieces of evidence presented to them step by step?
Yes, so thank you for the question. So that's true that in the first experiment, I think, or maybe both, at that time it was not possible to decide on the platform whether we want to have the same amount of male and female participants. So we had more female participants, but we checked whether there was any gender effect, and we didn't find any gender effect. So we could also generalize to male and female participants.
Thank you very much. Well, very often females are more likely to participate in different surveys. So that's maybe a bit expected, but just interesting from maybe psychological perspective, if there's any differences between males and females.
Yeah, also something that I didn't mention is that the two speakers were also presented as male. So we didn't compare whether it would be a female speaker. So this would be also interesting. But in our case, it was two male witnesses.
For this clarification. Are there any questions in the meantime? Is there anything anyone ever wanted to know about trustworthiness? This is the right time to ask Melinda. Yes, please, Claudia.
So thank you for your interesting speech. I wonder what is going on in all the people believing in conspiracy theories. So it's proven that these arguments are wrong, and they get more and more. It's like the right-wing parties. So everyone knows they're not telling the truth. And is it because the communication is more distant or like not direct? What is the reason for it? Because conspiracy theory, it makes me mad when I see all the people saying, I mean, we eat children living under the earth or something. So, and there are so many believers. So how does it combine with what you said?
Thank you very much for the question. So from what I know about conspiracy theory, because there is also a professor studying this more specifically at the University of Neuchâtel. So usually the people who are, so it's only a certain type of people who are more likely to believe in conspiracy theory, according to these researchers. So like these people need to have some psychological trait first. For example, people also with schizophrenia. This is one example, but then they also say it's more marginalized people who feel like out of the rest of the group. So maybe they have the impression to be part of another specific group of people who have the truth and all the others believe something wrong. So usually these people, they don't accept that this information is wrong. So they tend to mistrust the people who say that this theory is wrong. Also, these people usually tend to mistrust the government. So that's why also when the government tries to affirm that this theory is wrong, it's even worse because they don't trust from the beginning these people. So I think it's also related with this confirmation bias. But then something else that they found is that the people who believe the most strange conspiracy theory tend to believe all the others, while some people maybe will believe only those who could be possible or credible, but not the most impossible conspiracy theory. So yeah, maybe they don't base their trust on the same cues, or yeah, I think it's also related to this confirmation bias. So they have some previous beliefs and they don't want to accept the information that goes against their beliefs. So this is what I knew about conspiracy theory.
Okay, thank you. May I ask another question going in line
Yeah.
with this? There's an amount of people who are conspiracy theorists and are voters of far right-wing parties. So this is one group. I didn't dare to say that they have a kind of a psychological problems when they follow this, but this is it's proven that the sample is almost the same. So what is the reason for it? Has COVID changed us so much? Social media? What were the influences that this has risen so far?
Yeah, also sometimes it's related to fear. So maybe these people, yeah, they tend to be more afraid, for example, of other people coming into the community who are not part of their group. Yeah, so also these people tend to, like, they want to make sense of some particular events that seem like too easy to explain with the usual explanation that we give. So they tend to find other extreme explanations. But yeah, the fact that there are more voting on the right side, this I'm not sure I can give an explanation to that, because now it seems that the government is at the far side, so it means they shouldn't trust this government, but they still support them. So I think there is other factors behind that can explain this, but I'm not sure I can give an answer for that now.
Thanks for sharing the interesting insights.
Thank you so much, Melinda. So building a little bit on what Claudia said, I think it partly refers to the process of evaluation of the evidence. So you were mentioning in your models that you use trustworthiness based on evidence. So what are your conclusions so far when judging trustworthiness? Do people evaluate the quality of the evidence in a more rational way, or are they sometimes also influenced by factors such as how persuasive the speaker is, regardless of the actual critical examination of the evidence?
Yeah, so in this experiment, we controlled all the other variables that could affect trust because we really wanted to see the effect of evidence. But maybe if we add another variable like persuasion, then maybe some people would like be more affected by persuasion, others by evidence. Also, the issue is that in reality, it's often hard to have access to the evidence, or the evidence is complicated to understand. So we need to have some scientific background to assess it. So usually people use the simple cues that they can have. So in this experiment, we really gave them the evidence like on a plate. So it was easy for them to evaluate it. But I think that in real life, when it's more difficult to assess it, maybe they use more simple cue like persuasion. Yeah, and also people sometimes even disagree on whether a specific evidence is strong or not, even among scientists. Some scientists would say that this is a very strong evidence. Others would say, no, this is not evidence enough. So yeah, of course, it's not always an easy example as the one in the study that we conducted.
Thank you very much. Well, persuasion was probably not the best term that I used, but we have many examples nowadays of these populist far-right leaders who are also charismatic personalities. They talk in a very appealing way, and yet very often they fake the evidence that they present, or they distort the picture that it's an incomplete presentation of facts. And apparently there is a growing sizable and growing group of people who tend to believe them or find them trustworthy.
Yeah, as I presented also at the beginning, so there are many other cues that can affect trust. We saw also emotions. So we saw also prosody. So prosody is a way of conveying confidence, but then you can always deny, like politicians. Some politicians are good for denying having said something. For example, they also insinuate instead of asserting something directly. So they can always say afterwards, but I never really said that. And the use of emotion is also really important. They often use also the emotion of fear to be supported by their followers. So it would be really interesting to see when we add the variable of emotions, if evidence is still enough or not, or if the emotion is more important, and then people don't pay attention to evidence in this case.
Thank you, Melinda. We have another question from Claudia.
Sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm also part of the Truden project here in Ostam. My name is Claudia. What about the looks? How important are the looks? Because it's often mentioned by politicians and some psychological influence. For instance, people believe that people wearing glasses are more intelligent. The fairer the eyes are, the more trustworthy they are. So are the implication on the looks and this, psychological factors? People wearing glasses read more, so they must be more intelligent.
So yeah, we saw at the beginning that, for example, expertise can affect trust. So here I was more thinking of expertise according to the knowledge you have. I don't know if look could impact the way you think the person is competent. So I think there are different cues of competency. Maybe I don't know this literature, but maybe it could affect this. I know that there are some studies about the face. So not about the look, but really the face of the person. And apparently there was a study with children and adults, and they found the same results both with children and adults. They had different pictures of people in front of them, and it was really people who wanted to be president in the US. And they had to, but they didn't know that in advance. And so they had to select one person to be like the captain of the boat. So it was for children and adults. And people usually selected the same person, and it's the person who became president later. So, and this was only based on physical appearance. So this was not really look, but still they based just on some physical cues that trust. So something that I didn't mention in this presentation is that there are two types of mechanisms of vigilance, those who are more unconscious, automatic, very fast. So we think that, for example, basing trust on physical cues, for example, or accent, for example, is something more automatic, not really conscious. So we call this heuristics, and the others are more conscious. They have to think more about this. So this is the case for example, past accuracy. So we think that when people have to make very fast decisions, they tend to use more these fast automatic mechanisms that have evolved already a long time ago, and that were most of the time maybe useful, and that's why humans kept these mechanisms. But in other situations, when they have also more time and maybe higher stakes, they will use more conscious and complex mechanism to calibrate their trust.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Melinda. What would be your recommendations to speakers or politicians, if you want to put it more in the field of politics, how to build up that trustworthiness on one hand, and on the other hand, what could be the ways for citizens to improve our accuracy of perceptions of this trustworthiness? Is it
So
something that can be learned through education or?
yeah, so the advice for the speakers, so based on this experiment, I would say that people should always calibrate their expression of confidence to the evidence they have. So if they don't have enough evidence, they shouldn't express too much confidence, and they should, as much as they can, also specify their sources, especially also when the consequences are important. For teaching, I hope that it's something that we can teach also, like people to make good trust decisions. So as I said, there are these very fast mechanisms. So I hope most of the time they can lead you to the correct decisions. But I think it's quite hard to stop these mechanisms. But so I think a way of teaching is always to say that we should really think about the decisions that we make and do not make fast decisions when it comes to trust, especially in political trust. Yeah, maybe we could give some examples to people with like manipulating the variables and ask them like, how would you trust this person? And then give them some advice about how this decision was not a good one in these situations and train them. So I hope it's something. But also what I want to say is that all these studies that I presented today, it was conducted with one participant in front of a screen. So this is an individual decision based just on two sources of information. But of course, usually decisions are taken in a group. So, and sometimes just the network can affect a lot. So that's why now for my postdoc, I want to check whether these mechanisms are still useful also when we look at the group, because maybe someone can be very vigilant, but depending on which shares information to whom and how the structure is, the structure of the network is, then even mechanism of vigilance is not enough. So yes, this is also a question for further research. So I hope that as a group, we can still make good trust decisions. I hope I will find that in the results.
Thank you very much, Melinda. Well, we have a bit of time for the last round of questions. So if anyone would like to ask Melinda anything about trust, trustworthiness, and evidence, please write it or raise your hand. Yes, indeed, this is an issue with all lab experiments that you can only generalize them to the real world to a limited extent because so many variables
Yeah.
and basically the respondents are in a controlled environment.
Yeah, to be sure that one specific variable has an effect, we always have to control the others. But then it's so simplistic. We don't know if we can generalize that to the real world. But so then the idea is to just make a new experiment where we add a new variable. And by doing simulations, it's easier to add different variables and make some simulations to find the results.
Thank you so much, Melinda. We seem to have no more questions. Everybody is very much impressed with your presentation, and maybe they will contact you later by email. Thank you so much for your time to present despite the time difference, and thank you everybody for joining. I put a link in chat to the program or to the program of TrueDem webinars. This is a list of past webinars and also forthcoming webinars. You are welcome to watch our present recordings of our present meetings, and I hope to see you all or most of you in our future webinars. Thank you so much and have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you again for the questions and the attention and for the invitation.